Hello, everybody. Better Spaces is a health and happiness solution for today's hybrid workplace. My name is Dr. Paul Kachoa with PAR5 Physical Therapy, and I've partnered with them to bring you an easy and educational workday session. Today's session is spring stretches for runners. I've been a physical therapist for over 20 years, and I specialize in orthopedics and sports medicine. And today we're going to be going over 3 things that you should know to help you out on your next run and to avoid injury. All right, so let's get started. Let me pull up my slides here. Spring stretches for runners. Okay, I know that as the weather gets warmer, we look to getting our fitness and our workout routine outside to enjoy the weather, but want to make sure that we're doing it safely and not setting ourselves up for injury. Now, because I am a physical therapist, I have to give this disclaimer that this is not physical therapy. This is just general information for a broad population. But if you are dealing with something specific, like a specific injury, these tips that we're going to go through today are helpful, but might not encompass a full solution for what you're dealing with. So please, if you're dealing with something specific, have a physical exam done and physical assessment to get to the root cause of your particular issue. All right. So our body functions on this alternating pattern of stability and mobility. If this pattern is disrupted, then pain or injury is the result. All right. So for example, the main thing that we want to do is to have our knees be a stable joint, have our hips be a mobile joint, and importantly for runners, to have our ankles be as mobile as possible. A lot of times with runners, it's a very repetitive motion, and if our body and tissues are not able to tolerate that repetitive motion, then typically we get aches and pains and injury. So our first tip is we want to get in shape to run, not run to get in shape, all right? A lot of times people will just go out, grab a pair of sneakers and just go out for a run. But if we look at running as, again, like I said before, a repetitive motion that can create repetitive stress on your body, we want to make sure that your tissues are able to tolerate that so we don't get any tendinitis or joint pain. And also, we want to be able to look at running as a high-level performance sport. Moving well enables you to move more efficiently and thereby increase your ability to run without getting too fatigued. All right. Our second thing that I want to cover is the difference between static stretching and dynamic stretching. Dynamic stretching is a movement that is a large range of motion that is not held for any particular set of time, and it is done prior to a activity. So dynamic stretches are the type of stretches that you're going to do prior to running, beginning of your run. Try to fit it in as your warm-up. Static stretches, on the other hand, are stretches that are held for at least 30 seconds to create elongation in tissue. To try and address the tightness, we want to try and hold those stretches for at least 30 seconds. And those are static stretches, and they should be done after your activity. The research shows that if you do a static stretch before an activity, it actually reduces the ability for that muscle to create force. So therefore, that muscle is weaker for a short period of time after the static stretch. So you don't want to be weaker when you're going into the run. We want to be strong and be able to get into our routine. All right. The other thing I could say is that think about your cadence. When you are out running, the ideal cadence or the ideal number of steps per minute that you should be able to step is 180 steps per minute. Okay, so that's 90 times that one foot is going to hit the ground. So there are playlists on Spotify and other streaming services that have a song selection, a playlist that is set at 180 beats per minute. And if you run to that beat, that will decrease the time that your foot spends on the ground and also reduces the ground reaction force, right? So basically every time that your foot hits the ground, there's a reaction force of the ground, creating that shock and stress up the body. To minimize that, we want to try and increase our cadence to 180 steps per minute. Okay, so less time on the ground, less impact force. So let's get into some of these stretches. All right, we talked about the dynamic warm-up, and then we're going to go over some hip flexor stretches, some common hamstring stretches, glute stretches, IT band, TFL stretches, and then some ankle mobility. All right, so the first thing I want to take you through is a test here to see how flexible the front part of your lower body is. All right, so we have your hip flexor, which basically does this. You have your quads, which also assist with hip flexion, but they also extend the knee. And then you have your iliotibial band, this lateral side tissue here. So typically when people come into me and they're runners and they have injuries, we're looking at either problems in these two areas, the front line or the lateral line. So here's the test. You're going to get yourself onto a coffee table, bench, edge of your bed. It doesn't matter. You're going to check, do you have full range of motion and available flexibility in your leg and hip? So I'm just going to sit here and pull my knee into your chest. What we're looking at here is the ability for me to bend my knee sufficiently to get my calf to touch my hamstring. All right, so that's physiologically normal range of motion. And I'm looking at how far my heel is from my butt. All right, can I get it to touch? Great, right? If I can't, whatever that is, we're going to look at that and feel that motion. That'll come into importance later. Make note of that. And we're also looking at how much hip flexion do I have. Can I bring my knee at the very least above my hip joint, right? So I got that. I'm going to check the other side, make sure that I have full knee flexion and hip flexion. And now we're going to do a test for the right leg in this instance here. My right leg is going to stay on the ground, nice and relaxed. And I'm going to pull my left knee into my chest. I'm going to hold that in nice and tight and kind of keep that that thigh touching my belly here. And I'm going to lie back. And as I lie back, if I keep this other leg relaxed, what I'm looking at here is that my thigh should be able to hang out relaxed, parallel to the ground. All right. A lot of times, if you're holding this in and this leg is totally relaxed, and you look down at your leg and you see that your thigh is elevated, it's not touching the ground, I mean, it's not parallel to the ground, that means that your hip flexor is tight. So for me, my hip flexor isn't tight, but my quad is tight, and we'll test that out later. You can see here that my angle of my knee when I'm holding this in isn't really quite at 90 degrees. I would like it to be here, and that would indicate not so tight with our hip flexor or our quad. I'm going to test the other side, and I know on this side it's a little bit tighter on the IT band, on the lateral side tissues. So I have this into my chest, that kind of flattens out my back and rotates my pelvis in the right position. Now if I look down at my thigh, looking down vertically here, my knee is not in line with my shoulder or my hip. So if I'm going to turn this around and then kind of give you the top-down view here, this is an indication that my TFL, my IT band, and my lateral line here is a little bit restricted in terms of my mobility. So I'm going to hug this into my chest. As I lie back, what happens is that this thigh sits out at an angle. So that indicates that we're tight on the IT band side. All right. We talked about how much space your heel to butt is in this position. Now we could check that out and then try and do it in standing. So ideally, we should be able to get into this position and pull your knee into your butt. I'm going to hold on to my treadmill here, and we're looking at, can I replicate the same distance from heel to butt in the standing position that I did in my sitting position? If not, this indicates that you have a tight knee, and the tight structure could be the joint or it could be the quad, depending upon how far this is and in what position it's the worst, right? So if I'm here and then also looking down, I'm going to show you from the front view here, I want that knee to be in line with my hip and shoulder, okay? I don't want to do a quad stretch where my leg is out like that, because again, that gives slack to that lateral quadricep and the IT band and that lateral line. We want to be able to bring that knee in so it's lined up with the hip and shoulder, and I'm going to bring that knee backwards, all right? So that's our quad stretch. That should be a classic one. Everybody should be able to do that. That is in our example of a static stretch, and that should be held for at least 30 seconds. Okay, so if we did this test over here and you felt like, oh, my hip was tight, my thigh didn't come parallel to the ground, then we're going to do a hip flexor stretch. And that hip flexor stretch classically is done two different ways. Now, the first way is just get into a half kneeling position, right? So we have this knee. You can put a cushion underneath your knee if you need to. But here, a lot of times people will get into this position and just kind of go like forward like this and be like, oh, I don't feel a stretch. I need to search for that stretch. The hip flexor crosses several joints. It crosses the lower back, starts on your lower back. It crosses the pelvis, and then it crosses the hip. So when we're doing the stretch, we want to make sure that the points of contact, or the attachment point and the insertion point of this muscle, is as stable as possible, so that when we pull one end, the other end doesn't come along, right? So if I'm just not engaging anything and just kind of going in here, I'm going to be searching for the stretch and be like, oh, I'm just going to go in here. Like, yeah, I got it. But to make the stretch more effective, we want to make sure that we stabilize. So from here, before I move my hip forward, I'm just going to squeeze this butt cheek as hard as I can. I'm going to flex this up as hard as I can, and that takes my pelvis and tucks it underneath into a more neutral position instead of this anterior tilt, right? So once I get that on, I'm going to contract the abdominals as well. That pulls my rib cage down. So here I've got my hip and my lower back engaged and stabilized. And then maintaining contraction of those 2 points, I'm just going to shoot my hip forward. As I slide it forward, I don't need to move that much. I get the stretch already. Okay? So then that becomes more specific than just kind of just relaxing and then going forward. All right? So I'm going to do the other side. And again, this is going to be our static stretch. This will be done after your run. So again, engage the glute, engage the abdominals, let yourself go forward. Again, if you're looking here at this camera, we want to make sure that knee, hip, and shoulder are in line as you kind of translate your hip forward after you contract the abdominals and the glute. All right? So 30-second hold. And then we can do a hamstring stretch. So hamstring stretches are super easy. Probably it's the most common one anyone does. It's, just sitting down. Oh, actually, the second version of the hip flexor stretch would be a little bit more advanced, using the bench here, is what we call a couch stretch. I'm going to start on this all fours position. I'm going to put one foot up onto the bench here. I'm going to put the other foot out in front. So I'm still making that same shape that I did before in that half kneeling position, but because my ankle, my foot is up on this bench here, that creates a lot more stretch on this whole anterior line. But the same things still apply. The same rules still apply. We want to try and contract the glute, squeeze the butt, and keep the abdominals on so that we make this stretch as specific as possible and not have it be done haphazardly. All right, so this is the couch stretch. All right, 30-second hold, and then we can kind of move into our hamstring stretch. So our hamstring stretch is kind of classic. The big thing is, again, is that the hamstring goes and inserts below the knee, and it goes to the pelvis. A lot of times, again, when we're looking to get this stretch, I don't want to round out the back. So I can kind of go in here and be like, yeah, look, I can touch my toes. And I'm rounding out my back. The big thing here is that if I don't stabilize my pelvis, I'm going to get this stretch somewhere else. And again, we want this to be specific into the hamstring. So I'm going to sit up as tall as I can. That locks up the pelvis. And then keeping my height, I'm going to hinge at the pelvis. Or hinge at the hip. So as I kind of tilt my body forward without rounding, I get a stretch more immediately in this position, right? So again, when we do the stretch, we want to make sure that the origin and insertion point, the 2 points of that muscle, are as stable as possible. I don't want to have the pelvis be unstable by rounding my back. I want to be tall and get into this position. Okay, so those are our hamstring, hip flexor, quad stretch. And then, another one that I like to have people do is work on their calf. So I like to have it with the heel supported on the ground and something to elevate the front part of your foot. I know a lot of people will kind of go and grab like a curb or a step and just kind of drop here and then get that stretch into the calf. The problem with that is that the foot is unsupported. And when we do a stretch where the foot is unsupported, it creates more stress on the ligaments that hold the bones of the foot together. And then that can kind of lead into problems with a collapsed arch or plantar fasciitis or stuff like that. So we want to make sure that the heel is supported when we get into that stretch. The knee is going to be straight, and I'm going to bring my pelvis forward. Okay, it's a very simple, simple stretch. We want to make sure that the foot that I'm stretching is pointed straight. Okay, so from the front view, I don't want my foot to be out like that as I'm going forward. Okay, I want to foster a straight and mechanically sound position. So I'm going to make sure that that foot is pointed straight when I do that. There's two muscles in the lower leg we want to stretch. So we want to make sure that we're stretching one with the knee straight and then repeating that stretch with the knee partially bent. So same thing goes. I'm just going to hold this for 30 seconds, a partially bent knee, and that's going to stretch out the calf. Okay. And then last one that we're going to do is this IT band, this lateral side here. The stretch for that is taking that foot. I'm going to do my right side first. So I'm going to keep that behind me. I'm going to cross over slightly with my left foot. And then I'm going to bring my hip forward and then my trunk to the other side. So that's what's going to happen is going to lengthen this right side. All right. So this is the front view. I can kind of just tilt my pelvis this way, tilt my shoulders this way with this foot again, straight, knee straight, cross over, and then pelvis goes to the right, shoulders go to the left. I get this stretch onto the side. From the side view, it looks like this, lined up straight. Take the other leg, cross it in front. I'm going to be stretching my right hip here. Stay tall, bring my pelvis forward, and then I tilt, get that pelvis going out to the side, the right side, as I tilt my trunk the opposite way, and that should give me that stretch down that lateral line. Again, all of this so far is going to be a static stretch, and then we're done for 30 seconds. Got to hold it for 30 seconds. Anything less, and that tissue snaps back into a shortened position. We don't create a permanent change in the length. 30 seconds is the bare minimum to hold any static stretch. All right, so now, moving on, we're going to reverse it, go back to what a dynamic stretch is. A dynamic stretch is something that you do to prep for your run before you go out. So a couple of things I like to do is just work on balance, all right? So every step that you take, we're in this position for a split second. And if you're not stable, that can create issues in the knee, hip, back, whatever. So we want to make sure that I'm going to kind of get into this position, single leg balance. I'm going to take my hands at 90 degrees, and I'm just going to rotate like this or swing them back and forth. This is basically the movement that you do when you run, okay? I've got my knee down, but my foot is off the ground. Here's a side view, and I'm just going to do this, arm swing. That kicks up my balance centers and hip and ankle muscles around the left side as I'm doing this. If you want to add some difficulty with that, we could bring the knee up in front, activating the hip flexor, activating the abdominals, and then do the arm swing, okay? So doing this for about 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds is sufficient, and we do this on both sides, and that'll help warm up your balance and get your limbs ready for the run, all right? So again, more advanced is the knee up at hip height, doing my arm swing. And the key thing here is that I'm stable over this limb. I'm not rotating or going side to side. I'm engaged with my glute, my abdominals, my arms are swinging back and forth. All right, and then we could do a leg swing. It's basically a dynamic hip, quad, and hip flexor, quad, and hamstring stretch. We're just gonna stand here, and I'm gonna take one leg, and I'm gonna swing it forward and backward, that's all. Right, so the range of motion should be as big as possible to create a little bit of a stretch in the hamstring as I bring my leg back and into the hip and quad when I let my leg go forward. As I'm doing this, I'm not moving the upper body stays still, right? So here's the front view. I'm just gonna do about 20 to 30 seconds of swinging in this direction and then repeat on the other side. So what we're looking for here is how long I can make my hamstring as I reach forward and how much hip extension I can get. How far can I get my knee behind me as I do this stretch? So a lot of times people come in and just do this, right? And then they don't get any hip extension. If you don't have any hip extension, what happens is that that's the way that you run. When we're running, the one fault that I see with a lot of runners that run into injuries is that in that split second when they're in this position and they're going to pick up and then put the other foot in front, there's no hip extension. This knee is like directly below them. They're not extending through the hip, all right? So that creates a lot of issues mechanically down the line. So as you're doing this dynamic stretch, we want to make sure that we're extending through the hip and keeping the trunk still so that I don't hyperextend my back, right? So I'm not changing this angle here as I'm doing this, okay? So the other one that we can do as a dynamic stretch is just across the body. It doesn't have to be a big move, but there is a little bit of rotation as you're running. Not a lot. We don't want the arms to cross midline as you're running, because mainly we want the running technique to be very straight, single plane. But there is a little bit, maybe like 10 to 15 degrees of rotation at the trunk and the pelvis. So another one that I like to do is just across the body. And what that does is just, again, work on balancing of the one leg and activates the hip a little bit, and then kind of gets you ready to run when we warm up the glute and the hip. Okay, so this is dynamic leg swings are another dynamic stretch that you can do prior to your run. Another one is simple. If we could just do skips, right? So skipping, just a kind of like a low skip, kind of getting the ankles and the hips warmed up, right? And then when we're ready, we can go into a high skip, really driving the knee up, using the arms up and down to kind of get the heart rate up, and then activate our ankles, our hips, our glutes, our quads. Okay? So hopefully that was helpful.